Something unusual is unfolding far above the battlefield in Ukraine, not in the trenches, not along the front lines, but in the invisible layer of space where satellites silently orbit the Earth. In modern warfare, control no longer begins with tanks or missiles, it begins with information, with who can see first, react faster, and communicate without interruption. In the early days of the conflict, Ukraine faced a familiar danger that has destroyed armies throughout history: the collapse of command and coordination. Communication towers were damaged, fiber cables were cut, and entire regions risked becoming isolated. It was at this moment that Starlink emerged as a lifeline. Thousands of satellite terminals restored connectivity almost instantly, allowing Ukrainian units to transmit data, guide drones, and coordinate movements across vast distances. For many observers, this looked like a technological miracle, proof that innovation could tilt the balance of war. Yet history rarely allows advantages to remain one-sided for long. Every system that proves effective eventually attracts attention from the other side. And while much of the public focus remained on weapons deliveries and battlefield maps, a quieter process was already underway. Russian military planners were studying Starlink not as an obstacle to destroy, but as a structure to understand. Because in wars between major powers, the most dangerous question is never how to block technology, but how to adapt to it. As months passed, reports began to surface suggesting something had changed. Russian drones were operating at longer ranges. Signal disruption appeared less effective. Control teams seemed farther from the front. These were not coincidences. They hinted at a deeper transformation unfolding behind the scenes. The battlefield was no longer defined only by geography, but by networks. And once war enters the realm of networks, traditional rules begin to weaken. What started as civilian infrastructure was drifting into a gray zone where ownership, responsibility, and intent became blurred. The moment Starlink proved it could decide outcomes, it also became something else entirely, a strategic asset beyond the control of any single government. That is where the real danger begins, because when war depends on systems no one fully governs, escalation no longer follows political logic, but technical momentum. To understand why this shift matters, it is necessary to return to the earliest phase of the war and examine why Starlink became so essential in the first place. Ukraine entered the conflict facing a structural disadvantage in conventional firepower and manpower, but it possessed one critical strength: flexibility. Small units relied heavily on drones, real-time intelligence, and rapid coordination. None of that works without stable connectivity. Starlink filled this gap with remarkable efficiency. Satellite terminals allowed commanders to maintain situational awareness even when infrastructure collapsed. Drone operators could stream live video. Artillery units could adjust fire within seconds. From a tactical standpoint, it was revolutionary. But every revolution creates dependency. Over time, Starlink stopped being a backup system and became the backbone of operations. This created a vulnerability that was not immediately visible. When a military relies on a single digital nervous system, that system becomes as important as ammunition. Russian forces quickly realized that traditional electronic warfare methods were insufficient. Jamming entire regions was inefficient and often ineffective due to the density of the satellite network. Instead of brute force disruption, analysts suggest a more sophisticated approach began to form. Russian units observed how Ukrainian forces integrated Starlink into drone warfare and adapted similar logic. Civilian technology does not discriminate between users. A satellite cannot determine the intention behind a signal. As long as a terminal connects, data flows. This fundamental neutrality opened a dangerous door. Gradually, evidence emerged that Russian drones were achieving longer endurance and more precise coordination. Some Ukrainian soldiers examining downed drones reported unfamiliar communication components. These were not official military systems, but improvised solutions designed to interface with commercial networks. This is how modern adaptation works. Not through official declarations, but through field-level innovation. The conflict was no longer simply about who had better weapons, but who learned faster. Once both sides operated within the same digital ecosystem, the battlefield entered a paradox. To shut down the network would mean harming oneself. To tolerate it meant allowing the enemy to benefit. This dilemma has no clean solution. It represents the moment when technology escapes strategic control and begins shaping decisions on its own. As the war progressed, drone warfare evolved from a supporting role into a central instrument of pressure. Drones were no longer just tools for observation, they became the primary means of striking targets, probing defenses, and exhausting enemy positions. This transformation required one thing above all else: stable high-bandwidth communication. Advanced drones rely on constant data flow, high-resolution imagery, and precise remote control. Any delay or signal loss can mean failure. Starlink provided exactly what this new style of warfare demanded. Analysts began noting that drone operators were no longer required to remain near the front line. Control teams could operate from deep behind defensive lines, reducing exposure and increasing survivability. This altered the risk equation dramatically. Warfare became safer for the operator and more unpredictable for the target. Distance lost its protective value. In earlier conflicts, pushing enemy artillery or drone crews farther back reduced their effectiveness. Now that logic weakened. The front expanded vertically into space. What made this especially dangerous was the mutual reliance on the same system. Electronic warfare units faced an impossible choice. Broad interference would disrupt friendly operations. Precision interference required sophisticated detection capabilities that took time to develop. Meanwhile, drone attacks continued. This dynamic gradually turned the conflict into a contest of endurance rather than decisive breakthroughs. Each side sought to wear down the other through constant pressure. Technology accelerated the tempo but did not reduce the cost. It only redistributed it. Ukrainian commanders increasingly emphasized technological substitution for manpower, while Russian doctrine leaned on scale and continuous adaptation. Neither approach offered a quick resolution. Instead, the war entered a grinding phase defined by learning curves. Every week brought adjustments. Every improvement was temporary. This is how modern conflicts evolve, not through dramatic turning points, but through quiet optimization. And within this environment, civilian satellite infrastructure ceased to be neutral. It became an active layer of combat, not officially acknowledged, not legally defined, but operationally decisive. The danger lies not only in what this enables today, but in what it normalizes for tomorrow. The growing reliance on satellite connectivity has placed private technology companies and Western governments into an unprecedented strategic dilemma. Starlink was never designed as a weapons system, yet it now performs functions indistinguishable from one. This creates a tension that modern international law is poorly equipped to handle. If access is restricted, friendly forces may suffer. If access remains open, adversaries adapt and benefit. Neutrality becomes impossible once effectiveness is proven. From a strategic perspective, this situation introduces instability. Civilian infrastructure becomes entangled in military calculations without formal accountability. Decisions made by engineers and executives begin influencing outcomes traditionally reserved for states. This is not conspiracy, it is structural reality. Open-source intelligence reports have already warned that satellite networks demonstrating battlefield value inevitably attract countermeasures. Once targeted, escalation becomes difficult to contain. Russia has reportedly increased investment in electronic warfare systems focused not on destroying satellites, but on identifying uplinks and manipulating signals. This represents a shift from denial to disruption. Rather than silencing the sky, the goal becomes selective interference. Such methods are harder to detect and easier to deny. Ukraine, meanwhile, faces mounting pressure. Technology can offset shortages only temporarily. Drones can observe and strike, but they cannot occupy terrain or sustain morale. Over time, war returns to human limits. This creates a dangerous asymmetry. One side relies on innovation to preserve lives, the other relies on endurance to absorb losses. History shows that neither approach guarantees victory. What matters is sustainability. And sustainability depends not just on tools, but on social resilience. As the conflict continues, the satellite layer above Ukraine reflects a broader transformation in warfare itself. Power is no longer measured solely by weapons stockpiles, but by control over systems that enable decision-making. When those systems belong to no single actor, war becomes harder to manage and easier to escalate unintentionally. This is the silent risk embedded in the Starlink dilemma. Not the technology itself, but the precedent it sets for conflicts yet to come. As the conflict stretches into its prolonged phase, the question surrounding Starlink is no longer purely technical. It has become strategic and political at the same time. When civilian infrastructure begins influencing battlefield outcomes, governments are forced to confront uncomfortable realities. Western officials face a dilemma with no elegant solution. Restricting access risks weakening Ukrainian coordination. Allowing unrestricted access risks enabling Russian adaptation. This is not a failure of policy, but a consequence of modern interconnected systems. Technology now moves faster than regulation. In previous wars, weapons production could be controlled by states. In this war, connectivity is produced by private networks operating across borders. That distinction matters. It blurs responsibility and complicates escalation management. Analysts increasingly note that once a system becomes essential, its disruption becomes destabilizing. Starlink terminals are now embedded into daily operational routines. Removing them abruptly would fracture command structures and slow response times. Yet leaving them untouched allows adversaries to continue exploiting loopholes. This creates a condition known in strategic theory as mutual vulnerability. Neither side can strike the system without harming itself. Such conditions often freeze conflicts rather than resolve them. They extend wars by preventing decisive disruption. Meanwhile, diplomatic pressure grows quietly behind the scenes. Governments must consider whether commercial platforms should be integrated formally into defense planning or kept at arm's length. Either choice carries long-term consequences. Formal integration risks legitimizing private control over warfare. Distance risks chaos during crisis moments. The Ukraine conflict thus exposes a structural gap between modern warfare and political authority. Power flows through networks that do not belong to states, yet states remain responsible for outcomes. This imbalance is not ideological, it is systemic. And once systems dominate decision speed, leaders are forced to react rather than direct. That is how escalation slips from policy into momentum. Not because leaders choose confrontation, but because infrastructure leaves them few alternatives. Beyond technology and policy, the war is increasingly shaped by human limits. As months turn into years, fatigue becomes a strategic variable. Ukraine's reliance on drones and digital coordination reflects an attempt to conserve manpower and reduce casualties. This approach is rational and necessary, yet technology cannot fully replace soldiers. Terrain must be held. Supply lines must be defended. Morale must be sustained. Analysts observing the conflict emphasize that wars of attrition ultimately test societies more than armies. While drones multiply striking power, they do not generate resilience. Every innovation extends capacity but also introduces dependency. When systems fail, stress multiplies rapidly. Russian strategy, by contrast, emphasizes endurance and continuous pressure. Rather than seeking dramatic breakthroughs, operations aim to exhaust opponents gradually. This difference in approach defines the rhythm of the war. One side seeks efficiency, the other seeks persistence. Neither is inherently superior. What matters is which society can sustain its chosen model longer. Starlink's role intersects with this struggle in subtle ways. Stable connectivity reduces chaos. It preserves order under pressure, but it also increases expectations. When communication becomes constant, any disruption feels catastrophic. Psychological reliance grows alongside operational reliance. This is rarely discussed openly, but it shapes decision-making. Leaders become risk-averse toward systems they depend upon. They hesitate to alter what appears to be working. Over time, flexibility narrows. The conflict thus evolves into a layered contest. Not only weapons versus weapons, but stamina versus innovation, adaptation versus exhaustion. Technology accelerates the pace, but it does not simplify the outcome. History reminds us that prolonged wars rarely end through clever solutions. They end when one side can no longer bear the cost. That cost is measured not only in resources, but in collective endurance. And in this war, endurance is being tested on multiple levels at once. As the battlefield stabilizes without resolution, a deeper transformation becomes visible. The Ukraine conflict is no longer defined solely by territory gained or lost. It is defined by systems competing for dominance: information networks, satellite constellations, electronic warfare platforms, decision cycles measured in seconds rather than days. In such an environment, superiority is temporary. Every advantage is copied. Every innovation is countered. This produces a war of continuous adaptation. Commanders plan not for victory, but for survivability. Analysts describe this as systemic warfare, where disruption matters more than destruction. Rather than eliminating forces, each side seeks to degrade the opponent's ability to coordinate. Connectivity becomes the battlefield itself. Starlink symbolizes this shift. It is not the cause of escalation, but the medium through which escalation flows. Once combat depends on digital systems, errors become amplified. A technical glitch can resemble an attack. A software update can alter battlefield behavior. Misinterpretation becomes easier. Trust becomes fragile. This increases the risk of unintended escalation, not through deliberate choice, but through misaligned signals. In earlier eras, escalation required physical movement of troops. Today, it may require only a change in network behavior. This compresses reaction time for leaders. Decisions once debated for days must now be made in minutes. That pressure reshapes politics. Strategic patience erodes. Short-term stability becomes more valuable than long-term planning. The danger is not sudden catastrophe, but gradual normalization of permanent tension. A world where crises never fully end, only pause. Ukraine has become the testing ground for this model, not because anyone intended it, but because modern warfare left no alternative. The lesson extends beyond Eastern Europe. Any future conflict involving advanced states will likely follow similar patterns. Systems first, soldiers second. And once that logic takes hold, disengagement becomes increasingly difficult. As this conflict continues, one truth becomes increasingly clear. The most enduring impact of the war in Ukraine may not be territorial or even military. It may be conceptual. A precedent has been established. Civilian technology can become militarized instantly. Private networks can influence strategic outcomes without intent, and modern war can unfold within systems no government fully controls. This does not imply malice or conspiracy. It reflects structural change. Power has migrated into infrastructure. Satellites, data links, algorithms. When these elements shape decision-making, traditional diplomacy struggles to keep pace. The danger is not that technology creates war, but that it narrows the space for de-escalation. Once systems are embedded, removing them carries risk. Leaders hesitate. Conflicts persist. Over time, war becomes managed rather than resolved. The Starlink dilemma illustrates this clearly. It was introduced to preserve communication and reduce chaos. Yet its very effectiveness transformed it into a strategic dependency. Dependencies shape behavior. They constrain options. They influence timing. In this sense, the battlefield above Ukraine mirrors a broader global shift. The future of conflict will be less about dramatic offensives and more about persistent pressure within interconnected systems. Stability will depend not only on power, but on restraint and coordination across technological domains. History teaches that when innovation outruns governance, instability follows. The lesson emerging from Ukraine is therefore not limited to one country or one war. It speaks to a world entering an era where control is fragmented and responsibility is blurred. The challenge ahead is learning how to manage power that no longer sits neatly within borders. Because once war enters the realm of networks, peace becomes not a single decision, but a continuous process. And the world has only begun to understand what that truly requires.